Welcome to the Riverside Project podcast. We are mobilizing Houston to empower families and transform generations. We hope these conversations will give you a greater understanding of the issues facing our community and inspire you to find your place along the river. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Riverside Project podcast. Today, we have a guest with us, Gaelin Elmore. He is a dynamic and nationally sought-after keynote speaker, trainer, and thought leader. Driven by a childhood of trauma and lacking of belonging, Gaelin now works with organizations and people to become belonging-informed in order to help children overcome trauma and unleash their potential. Gaelin now lives in Burnsville, Minnesota, where he and his wife, Michaela, and his two daughters, Lanaya and Tatum, are patiently awaiting the birth of their third child in the family. So, Gaelin, thank you so much for being on the podcast with us today and sharing a little bit about who you are, the work that you do, and where you've come from.
Yeah, thanks, Amber. I appreciate it. I'm excited to be here and just be a part of this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as we start off with most of our guests, tell us just a little bit about who you are, what your background is, what you do, and just kind of the work that you get to do kind of in the foster care space and in the world that we live in.
Yeah. So I'm a husband, I'm a father. I am also a former foster youth that quote unquote defied the odds and made it to college. I had a chance to play college football at the University of Minnesota. That's where I met my wife, and then Minnesota kind of became home. I spent a brief little stint in the NFL with the Cincinnati Bengals, and that was after a childhood of just total trauma and adversity, of just unrelenting blow after blow, letdown after letdown. And so all those things had a massive impact on me and my development.
Yeah.
But there was always this lingering question from people of, man, Gaelin, how are you the way that you are, even having gone through everything you went through? And I never saw it as like, I'm just that special. So I never had an answer to that question. I always felt uncomfortable by it. I felt like an imposter. I felt unworthy. I felt like, man, there's nothing that separates me from the countless foster siblings that I had that I looked up to and aspired to be like when I was the youngest kid in the house. And so I struggled and wrestled with that. But and when I was kind of making this pivot from being an athlete to being an advocate in a lot of ways, I got into nonprofit youth work. And I just stumbled into this concept of belonging and learned about the psychology and the neuroscience of it. And the moment that I read the transformational power, when I read a couple sentences about what belonging can do for people, I immediately knew that is the thing that changed my life. I knew that was the answer to that question I had my entire childhood of Gaelin, how are you the way that you are? And despite all of the bad circumstance that I dealt with and I navigated, there were people that were meeting my belonging needs in a way that allowed me to continue to grow, learn, and thrive in spite of the things that I was experiencing. So that was a really big life moment for me. Now I work for myself. I partner with adults, professionals, and communities to implement belonging as they serve vulnerable populations. So a big part of that is child welfare. I do a lot of work with schools and caregivers, any adult or professional that would be in direct contact with the child that is unknowingly or knowingly, but largely children that don't know the trauma that they're navigating on a day-to-day basis. So really helping the adults in their life that walk with them day in, day out, be able to have language and understanding about what might be happening internally, but also to make it very tangible about what is it that you can do in this journey for them and with them. So that's what my work does now. And that's just kind of how my background has really snowballed into my kind of present and the way that my family eats and the way that we live. And I love it. I'm super honored to be doing the work that I'm doing.
It's awesome. I have so many questions. There's so many ways that, and so many just curiosities I have about just that process, right? You have an incredible story, and where it's taken you today. And so I definitely want to get into the work that you're doing now and what that looks like. You mentioned that belonging was like the thing that you realized changed your story.
Yeah.
When did that happen? Like, what was that moment for you? And then what kind of were you working out in that moment? And then what did you feel like was lacking in that space in terms of belonging? Of course, foster youth, we know that many kids who have grown up in foster care struggle with belonging, but nobody really knows what that actually means. No family equals no belonging, but there's so much more to it than that. How did you kind of wrestle through that? Can you share a little bit about just what that process was for you and getting to that specific word?
Yeah. I have two different like categories that come to my mind when I'm asked this question. There's one story that unquestionably I knew in the moment, even if I didn't have the word for belonging, I knew in the moment, I was like, this is what I needed.
Right.
And I also have stories that I can retroactively look at and know like, that thing or that experience or event wasn't as bad and really was kind of hopeful and life-giving, even though it was something that was so dark. So there are two ways I can go. I'm gonna share the first, and that came from when I was I was in the NFL. I was during my rookie season. It was my first and only off season, and I was just struggling to acclimate into this new environment. And really, what the struggle was that for so long I had unknowingly and unconsciously performed for my belonging, that I was struggling to find it in a space where like I wasn't getting that immediate return on my investment anymore. So I was really struggling.
Performing, right?
Yeah.
In that space, everyone's performing.
And all of the people that I was so close with that I had like kind of created this nice bubble for those 4 years of college, I was away from and I was disconnected from. And so I was really isolated. I was alone physically, but also relationally. And I just had this overwhelming sense that football wasn't it for me. And really, football was an idol. It was something that I thought would answer and solve all of the issues and problems that I had in my life. And it just wasn't going to. And so there was like this whole journey. And to just make a long story short, I come to the realization that I'm gonna leave. I'm gonna like quit playing football during the first half of my first year of my contract. And I was concerned about all the phone calls that I would have to make to inform people in my life that this was where I was going to go. And I kind of got through all the like the first 8 phone calls pretty well. Like Cincinnati, their like leadership, that was a weird call, but it went really well. I was very like encouraged by how they responded. I called my biological parents. I called like other people, and it was letdowns, but I was most scared to call my high school football coach, who had taken me into his home when I was 16 and really about to be homeless or enter back into the foster care system. His family took me into their home, and that was a really big pivot in kind of my like career trajectory, what felt like a possibility for me. Just new worlds opened up at that point in my life. And I just felt like there was so much about our relationship that was dependent on this game. And so I was shaking through the phone call. I called him and I was like, "Hey coach, I think I'm done playing football." And I said, I think, but like I had made all the calls. It was already, the train left the station. There was no going back.
Right.
And I was just waiting for the shoe to drop on the other side. And he just said, "Okay, what are we doing next?" And it was like that moment. I was kind of frustrated that there wasn't a bigger blow up or more frustration, but the like monotonous, like monotone way that he just kind of nonchalantly brushed off this whole life pivot that I'm making, this whole, like I'm in an early life crisis, and you just said, "Okay, what's next?" Was like, that was the moment. It was like, "Oh, you're one of my people. and you're a part of my tribe, regardless of where I'm going, what I'm doing, and what I'm wrestling with.
Mm-hmm.
And like, that was a moment that I needed in making this shift out of someone who was performing for belonging and someone that was going to find the places at which I belonged, every part of me, not just the good, not just what I've created for people to be willing and able to accept, but really the true, the scars, all of that. It immediately gave me a sense of calm and really hope of this next shift isn't going to be as bad as transitions or shifts had been in my childhood.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it doesn't have to be that way. So that's one that I knew in the moment, and I didn't have the word belonging, but I just knew. I was like, oh, like it dawned on me, and I was like, you're one of my people. And when I learned about belonging, like a year and a half, 2 years later, I immediately went back to that moment. I was just like, yeah. And then I was retroactively looking at a bunch of other ones and thinking about them and realized there were a lot of moments for me that were similar to that. Maybe not as like massive or life altering or impacting, but very similar to that moment.
Yeah, I could imagine in that moment you feeling very seen as a person, right? Not I am Gaelin, the football player, and detached from football. Who am I? Does anyone care about me? Is anyone with me without that other thing that I thought defined me, right? Mm-hmm. I think the same is that kind of definition and identity that many youth in foster care, one of the pet peeves that we have as an organization was when people say foster children or foster kid. We always say, like, that's not their identity. They're a child who happens to be in foster care in this moment or in this season. Yes, it's a defining part of their life. And yes, there are impacts, but that's not who they are. Mm-hmm. I think maybe in the same way, what you're saying is, football became another identity. And the question for, I think, any of us becomes, who am I apart from the things that have happened to me? Who am I apart from the things that I've done or accomplished? And when someone can look at you and say, I'm here for you, you're a football coach. I'm here for Gaelin, whether or not you do football. And you're like, whoa, that you actually are, like you said, my people, because you see me apart from the things I've done and the places I've been. I think that gets to what you're talking about with belonging, right? Is that is that on point? Is it off? Is that kind of defining?
No, I definitely feel like you're like right on track. You're hitting the nail on the head. I think there's this element too of belonging where there's this, I know you, I see you before you might even know or see yourself, right? Like, there's this element, like I see through the mask, I see through this facade that might be there that you think is helping you experience belonging. I see through that. And so I think that's something my coach did for me, but I think that's something that applies to us being in a relationship with young people navigating the foster care system. Is like, I see who you are before you realize I see you, right? Mm-hmm. Like, and then continuing to stick around long enough for one of those young people to then come to that realization that I did. I was like, oh no, you're one of my people. Like, you're not everybody else. There's so many definitions of belonging. And I'm really connected to the scientific definitions, just because belonging feels so fluffy and it feels so intangible, and so many people discredit it because it's like, oh, well, that's not real. And even though you went through hard stuff, doesn't mean that if I didn't go through that, I had something you didn't. Or this whole like belonging kind of discredits this pick yourself up by your bootstrap mentality that we love to clutch onto in our culture. So I love the scientific side of it, and the definition that is just so profound to me comes from Carl Rogers, where he basically breaks it down into 3 parts. And he says it's a yearning for connection with others, a need for positive regard, and a desire for personal interpersonal relationship. So really breaking into its community, its safety, and its intimacy. Like, those 3 things are what we need to experience belonging. Now, again, when you brought it up earlier, Amber, of the journey to belonging for youth navigating foster care. Like, how many of those three things are something that is prioritized in the decisions that we make within the system? Not very often. So that's just where my work comes in, of like, hey, how can we take these things that are scientifically proven to help people flourish in life, help people shift from surviving to literally like actively living?
Yeah.
How do we implement this so that young people who, at no fault of their own, are at a deficit, are starving, are malnourished when it comes to connection, intimacy, relationship, all of those things? So that definition for me is so beautiful, because it just connects to every aspect of our human physiology. And you can't just say, oh, it's these fluffy feelings. Like, no, it doesn't, that doesn't compute.
Yeah, we've been doing a lot of work in this space with, TBRI, trust-based relational intervention, and these trauma-informed. I think trauma-informed care is, thankfully, we live in a day and age where we're actually able to pair the science. We have MRIs, we have, things that can show that the brain does actually respond to healthy, stable relationships, and so we have that benefit. But I still think, like you said, there's an element of what does that really mean, right? Safe and stable relationships are what, in connection, are what kids need to thrive. And you're almost taking that to I think what the definition that you gave, that Carl Rogers, how he kind of really defined belonging, is almost like encompassing those relationships within a more broad and defined kind of characteristics. What does relationship really mean? Well, it's more than just a relationship with a safe person. We can give kids that. Sometimes, whether it's in group homes or in different situations, we're like, well, they have relationships. Why aren't they healing? It's not just the relationship by itself. It's this whole aspect of belonging. Yeah, that's good. You mentioned the people in your life, your coach. Was there anyone, was it that specific person that kind of shifted the trajectory for you? Were several people who gave you that aspect of belonging and relationship that you feel like changed your course in life? What would you say were those main people, and what did they do?
Yeah. I would say my coach was just, and I don't want to belittle his role, but like, he was just the final person, right? Like, if we're thinking about breaking down a wall, like, there were so many people that took shots, that like made valiant efforts to break down this wall that I carefully crafted to protect myself. And again, he was the last person, so it was a little bit less like formidable, but it still took a lot of effort. It still took a lot of follow through, still took a lot of consistency. And what I want to share with people out there is, you don't have to be the person that breaks down the wall in order to be someone who played a role. And I think oftentimes we feel so much pressure to be the Coach Larson in my story in the lives of other people. So when I'm speaking on a stage or doing a training, people are like, well, I can't bring a kid into my home. Like, no, that is not what I'm asking. But how can you do what is uniquely available to you to make a difference, to make maybe that path a little less difficult, or to make that wall a little less more formidable for the person that can. And so there were a lot of people that I could retroactively look back and kind of move these people into these categories of like, man, you were really helpful, or you cared about me a lot, but I feel like you gave up early, or there's all these different roles that people fall into. I mean, there's my elementary school janitor, someone that I think of so fondly, of just how she did her role and made me feel seen, made me feel like I belonged in a space that's or in a time of my life that was extremely dark. There are coaches, other coaches, there's one caseworker, there are people who absolutely played that. And I think there's this element of, this is going to be cliche because I share this all the time. But when I speak or do training, when we're talking about how we show up as supportive adults and people in the lives of those navigating trauma and difficult circumstance, I talk about 4 like characteristics that we need to exude in order to be a part of that journey in a positive, life impacting way. And it's compassion, authenticity, resilience, and empowerment. And it spells out care, but it's a model that there's not a single positive, supportive adult in my past that like didn't show up in those ways.
Yeah.
Compassionate being more than just empathy or sympathy. Compassion being, I see what you're dealing with. I see what you're carrying, and I'm going to do what's available to me to lighten that load for you. That might be a teacher, in which my elementary school teachers were phenomenal. That might be a teacher, instead of sending me to the office every time I have bad behavior, is instead of doing a timeout kind of a response, she does a time in response and asks me to come help her up front. It is those days that I have big blow ups, instead of like matching my energy or having this power struggle, she's going to meet me with humility and with connection. There was a time I was in an abusive home in foster care in my first, second, third grade teacher in her classroom. So that was complicated. I was in an abusive home for 5.5 years, from halfway through kindergarten through halfway through fifth grade year. And when I was going into first grade, I was entering a new school. It was a Montessori school. And so I had the same teacher for first, second, third grade. There were so many things being newly placed in a abusive home with this, in this placement, that made school really hard, beyond just being in a new environment, not knowing anybody, not belonging with my peers, like all of those things. But there was something that led me to missing a day of school. And I just remember that being a war zone mentally for me, as I sat home with my abuser, thinking about like how much better the school day is because I'm not there, right? I'm thinking about how much fun all the kids who don't know me or don't like me are having because I'm not in the room. I'm thinking about how much relief my teacher is experiencing because she doesn't have to deal with my behavior that day. So I remember the next day I was able to go to school. I was so committed to like being the worst possible kid I could be. Like it was going to be a bad day.
Just living
and
out
I was
of that
just like, yeah. And I was like, if I feel this, everybody else has to feel it. And I remember walking into her classroom, and she was helping another kid already. And I like made a scene. I threw my book bag into my cubby, like knocked a chair down, sat down. And it was just like, all right, let's go. And from across the room, she was just like, hey, Gaelin, I'm glad to see you this morning. She said, and this is what like disarmed me immediately. She said, we really missed you yesterday. Let me know what I can do to get you settled in. And I tell people all the time, I was like, have you ever been mad that you can't be mad anymore? Like, there's just like, I had all these ideas in my head about what I could do, and none of them are going to work because you just disarmed me with how you responded in this moment. And that created a bond between me and her that I did a training back in the city that I went through foster care in, and she wasn't able to attend, but we went and got food. Like, we talked. She brought photos from when I was in her class. Like, there was a bond there that I always knew I could lean on her. And so it's people like that, showing up with compassion. Authenticity is a big part because there were a lot of people in my life that overpromised and underdelivered, whether it was a caseworker, like a lawyer that was representing me in court, my parents, my coach, like friends' parents saying, hey, we're going to get licensed and we're going to get you out of that home. Like all these things that was always so much more detrimental than them not saying anything at all. Cause it gives you false hope. And then you start to identify all hope as false.
Right.
And so the authentic people made such a big difference because they never overpromised. They never said anything that they weren't going to do. And there were certain people that I could bet on of like, oh, you said you're going to do this, you're going to do it. And so you got to be authentic with what role you play in the life of a young person. Got to be resilient in the way of the person on the receiving end of your help that you're offering is going to push your buttons. They're going to push
Yeah.
you away. They're going to fight back. They're going to
Amazing.
build a wall. They're going to reject all those things. I mean, doing the work you do, I know you experience that. And so it's like, you're going to get pushback, but are you willing in the name of like, of opportunity or what's possible on the other side or belonging, are you going to resist against their resistance?
Mm-hmm.
Are you going to be resilient enough to stick through the mess with them so that when Gaelin decides to leave football, like you are there and you can he can recognize in that moment that, oh, you're one of my people, not because of what I was doing, but because you value me. And then lastly, empowering. Like we got to empower young people for their future. We got to model what it looks like to be in control in a way that is healthy and life-giving. If we just get people to a certain point, but then they don't have the keys or tools needed to continue on the path that they're on, then maybe the work we're doing is in vain. We're just kicking the can down the road, for a lack of a better phrase. So those are 4 things that I know all of the like people I hold so near and dear to my heart from my story showed up in those ways. And chances are the people who were problematic in my story didn't. And, or showed up the opposite. So yeah, that's what I typically share. And, self-care is something I value deeply. And actually there's research that backs like those things and what it does to our bodies, what it does to our relationships. So that's really cool.
That's really great. It's super helpful. And of course, I love a good acronym. It helps me to understand.
Don't we all?
Things,
yeah.
But yeah, going back, the idea of this fortress that you mentioned earlier, that there is every kid that's been through a significant amount of trauma, even adults, right? We've kind of built these walls to keep out, and for good reason. We're setting boundaries, and we're trying to protect. We're trying to protect because we've been hurt. And you mentioned that it's usually not just one person that demolishes. Maybe in some people's lives, it is just the one person, but the kind of chipping away that you mentioned, that there is for people who are working with a kid or in a kid's life and trying to be that person, knowing that you may be the one where it all comes down, and you may be the one in their life who's just making it, like you said, a little easier for that person that is down the road who is going to demolish it. But it's kind of a group effort. And I think if we see it and I think that some of that is where we get that savioristic mentality of, I'm going to be the one that saves this kid if I'm the foster parent or I'm the coach or and that's where it all gets a little bit tricky. And sometimes we don't really make the impact that we could because we have maybe the wrong perspective. We're playing the long game here, and being able to have the humility as a caregiver or as a helper to say, I'm just going to be here to be who I need to be in this kid's story. And that might be, I'm just chipping away a little bit and empowering them in a way with a skill, so that there are other people down the road who can continue to play a different role.
Yeah.
Speaking of that, you mentioned an elementary school janitor. I think there's so many people who are probably like, I'm a janitor, what can I do? Tell me about the janitor and how that person came to be such a significant person in your life.
Yeah. So her name was Miss Peanut. And she was nicknamed that because she was extremely short, which I know we're on Zoom, but I've always been a tall person. I was taller than her the day that I met her in first grade. And she was beloved in the school, but something that was, that I think was uniquely available to her that maybe other people didn't get, or it took them a long ways time to get. She lived in our neighborhood. She had worked at this school a long time. And so she had known that our home was a different kind of home. Although it was a foster home and she took in kids and there was this revolving door of kids, she knew like what type of person we were dealing with behind closed doors. And so she had like this intention before I even knew who she was to like connect, like to build a relationship, to support.
Wow.
And it's because of the relationship that she had developed and cultivated with kids, some of my biological siblings, long before I had ever stepped foot in that building. And so there was just like things she would do that was different. And if I found myself in school suspension a lot, I got in trouble a lot, even though I had teachers that were giving me breaks and giving me opportunities, like I still got sent down a lot. And she would use her role as janitor to like connect with me in a time when I'm not supposed to be connecting with anybody, right? So if anyone out there knows what in-school suspension is like, they're literally trying to isolate you from anything and everything. And she would use like her rounds or taking out trash or garbage as an excuse to make me do more work, but really we're just connecting the whole time. She's getting me out of that environment. There were times where I couldn't eat the free and reduced lunch that I was offered. And so I would just sit in the cafeteria hungry and not say anything to anybody. And on more than one occasion, she just brought food from the back and gave it to me without asking. Like I wouldn't say, "Hey, Miss Peanut, like I need something to eat." She would just go and drop it in front of me and then keep on going. And even with that, so that's all the good, right? But there's still some accountability that like, she's not just getting me out of trouble in the office. She's like holding me accountable. She's like, what do you, like, Gaelin, you can't make the same choices that everybody else makes. You know what you deal with when you go home is different than what everybody else has to deal with. So even while she's building connection and building this rapport with me, she's also using it to speak truth, like to let me know about my decisions, to challenge me to think bigger picture than just goofing off with my friends. And she did that. She made me feel seen in this body full of people that, hey, everyone is worthy of being seen or being someone that's the center of an adult's attention. She made me feel seen. And the interesting thing is, like, she did that for hundreds, thousands of kids who everyone felt like, hey, Miss Peanut's my best friend. And
I love that.
Yeah, and she never said, "Hey, Gaelin, I'm gonna get licensed and I'm going to take you into my home." She never said, "Hey, I'm gonna get my degree so I can be an educator and have more influence over you." Like, no, she was a janitor, but she was an awesome person. That custodial services wasn't her life's mission; it was just the pathway. It was the road, and so she just. And again, that is the gist of our relationship. I didn't stay in contact with her. I haven't seen her since, but she like will always be in my mind, my memories, and my heart because of how she showed up in ways that my own caregivers, like I could not name 95% of the people who were my foster parents while I was in care. Wow. There are two names that I remember off the top of my head. One of them was my abuser, and the other one was the last home before I went back with my father when I was going into 7th grade. So she just she showed up, and she was all those 4 things. She was compassionate, authentic, resilient, and empowering. And so yeah, it's just a really unique little special role that I'm so thankful for what she did at that season of my life.
Yeah. We talk a lot about the everyone can do something kind of idea. And really, as we're working in Houston to mobilize our community to do things, we always say not everyone should be a foster parent. Yeah. Can we look at what you have? Where are you? What talents, what gifts, what opportunities, what resources can you find, can you use along the river? That might be way upstream. That may be way downstream. That might be in the water. That might be far away from it, but in providing something. That's a perfect example of that, like you said, custodial services is probably not the thing she grew up thinking that was going to be her mission in life, but she found that by not going necessarily and getting a degree as an educator or becoming a foster parent, but using that as the vehicle by which you would give belonging to a child. I think if we all saw our circumstances and the things we have and just took a moment to think through what is it that I have to give, we could find many more avenues for that and get really creative about the way that we impact the next generation. 100%. Speaking a little bit more, I want to shift a little bit more and talk about the work that you are doing now, how you've used these experiences and this idea of giving belonging. Can you share a little bit more on the practicals of, I know that's speaking, I know that's kind of writing and doing things like this, but what is that trajectory for you? What's your vision for how to bring that idea into this space?
So continuing to just build my own understanding and grasp on the science around it, and then figuring out how do we make this language digestible for everybody. And really what is so interesting is that I got into sharing my story and the things that I experienced just because I had, through relationships, saw the value that it was bringing. Like I always thought it was conceited to think that my story would mean something to somebody else. But after doing it a couple times and being exposed to the right people, it felt selfish to not share because it might make the path for somebody else a little less difficult. And so I got into this before I had language about what the long-term vision would be. I'm just like, hey, I want to give back. I'm passionate about this. I feel uniquely like this is one of the unique ways I can be a part of the solution in those many paths. And then got into belonging. And then it was like, I want to commit the rest of my adult life to unraveling this and helping people implement it. So that is a big aspect of it. So I do a lot of professional development training and consulting around belonging. So helping people look at their own understanding about belonging, helping people understand, apply it to their norms, their culture, their if we're thinking about a school system, what their punishment or discipline guidelines might be. How are you implementing belonging? And so instead of doing again these timeout kind of procedures of suspension or in-school suspension, how can we still hold people accountable but use that as an opportunity to deepen connection? And so a big piece of it is just raising awareness about it, right? And so when I partner with organizations, there are 4 directions of belonging that we talk about. And really what people get sold on is this idea of bringing belonging to vulnerable populations, right? How do I help a new placement, a young child that has just been placed into my home? How do I help them feel belonging in my role? Or as a caseworker or CASA or GAL, how do I help that young person experience belonging? And so that is what I would call external belonging, right? How am I bringing belonging to other people? But that's actually the last thing that we talk about. It is more, that's an overflow of the other directions of belonging being something that is there's momentum and progress. So the other 3, first and foremost, the most important piece is for every person to understand and believe that belonging matters for their own development, thriving, and flourishing in life. If we can't retroactively look back and see whether good or bad, traumatized or picturesque kind of a childhood and upbringing and life so far, regardless of where you fall in that spectrum, can you objectively look back and say belonging had an important and vital role in my development or the person that I am today? Or can you acknowledge it wasn't present and this is maybe why these things have been more difficult for me? So it's really helping that professional understand and process their own journey about belonging, because if I don't think belonging matters for me, then I am just, again, putting belonging in this nice little neat box that I think from a savior mindset, this is what I'm bringing to you as a gift. If you don't think it matters for yourself, then you're not there will come a time, where you feel resistance and you're just man, maybe this thing doesn't matter as much as Gaelin says it does. So we really spend a lot of time on the internal aspect of belonging. And then we talk about, and these are more organizational, horizontal and vertical belonging. So do I feel like belonging is present in the place that I work? Do I feel like this is something culturally that we are prioritizing? Do I feel like belonging matters for my coworkers to be successful at the work that they do, and vice versa?
Yeah.
And then the vertical piece is within the structure and hierarchy of our organization. Is belonging something that we can champion? Is belonging something that can influence decisions and policy and procedure within our organization? And then we can get to external, right? Because if those things are struggling, it just creates a way more difficult path for us to bring it to families. And I look at struggles we have in retaining like professionals and caregivers and all of these people who are trying to be supportive for the kids and children navigating foster care. Like the lack of retention is, to me, a direct correlation to the belonging that they don't feel in the work that they're doing. And that just makes the path to serving young people harder. That just makes the path to like, how can I communicate to you, young 16-year-old Gaelin, that you belong here and you've had 4 new like foster parents in the last year and you felt like it's your fault, but really it's just like they were burnt out because they didn't have the support that they needed. Yeah. And so those are the 4 directions that we talk about. And there are a couple other things that we're trying to help people understand, but one of the most important is that safety and connection are the pillars of belonging. Yeah. Safety being physical and felt, like actual safety, but also relational safety. And then connection being like this intentional relationship building that is taking place. And that speaks to our central nervous system, that speaks to our fight-flight response. Yeah. All of that is something that's intentional. So those are kind of the filters for the work. But it's like everywhere from like, and quite literally testimonials from counties that I've been fortunate enough to work with of like, hey, we haven't given up on our kids as much. Yeah. Right. And when you experience those breakthroughs of like, man, we would have typically washed our hands of this situation at this point normally, but we stuck it out. We were resilient a little bit longer. Then we saw some change that gave us hope and inspiration to continue to do it for this person, but also for the next 50 that come after. And that is important because again, we need to feel like the work we're doing is mattering. And sometimes it just requires we stick in a little bit longer. So there versus like how we onboard caregivers, like how are we educating and training them for the purpose of what they're doing? You brought it up earlier, Amber, of like, you may not be the person that breaks down the wall, but you have a role in chiseling it. So if I come into being a caregiver and thinking my role is to break down the wall and give a kid like love, family, and connection, when you meet resistance, you realize, hey, this wall is a lot stronger than what I anticipated. You might think maybe I'm not cut out for the job. So instead, what is your role? Your role is not to ensure that this young person graduates high school or gets adopted or like never experiences X, Y, or Z trauma. That's not your role. Your role is to be a safe place that they can experience support and that they can go back to and not really question the reasons and motivations as to why you're doing what you're doing. And so again, changing how caregivers might be entering into the conversation as well. So there's so much that is new and don't totally understand yet, like trying my hardest to partner with different organizations to get like a belonging scale that is applicable to child welfare, but also applicable to other populations of young people in communities that experience trauma. And that's been one of the interesting things about this work, is I started thinking like, yeah, I'm going to be in foster care and maybe in education a little bit, because educators play such a big role for me. And it's expanded out to probation, to mental health, to adult support services, to to incarceration, to like all of these other spaces where they're like, we didn't have the language for that, but that's what we've seen with the success stories, and we need to do more of that implementation. And so again, just like a young me read belong and was like, that's it. There's so many other professions and people across our country that are like, yep, that's it. And so I'm super grateful to be a part of that conversation.
Yeah, I think we can see now enough success stories and see the patterns of what got them to that, quote unquote success, right? Stability and, if we can say successful stability, or being able to feel like they are empowered to move on into the future with stable relationships. We know that belonging is a part of that. We know that relationships are a part of it. And so often, I think we know the cure. Like, I'm from a medical background. It's like, we know the right treatment for this. Yeah. That's been established, but the road to get there is really hard. And it doesn't just happen because it's not a pill you can take. It's not a treatment that you can say, here's your diagnosis, here's your treatment plan, and you just do it. It requires everybody being a part of that process. And like you said, I love that you have the emphasis on the internal aspect, because you can't give somebody something you don't have. Exactly. And if we don't have it, and we're not cultivating and looking back at our own past and looking back at our own struggles, we can't help somebody get there. And so that's super important to really think through that and to empower. I know, caseworkers and people in the community. I think our society is not bent these days towards helping people belong, or like, I've been thinking a lot about hospitality and where does hospitality fit in this whole system of belonging and care and healing and the foster care space. What does it look like to bring this idea of true hospitality into this space where people can enter in and be welcomed in and be seen and cared for? It's the same idea of like hospitality and belonging are one and the same in many ways. But it's largely, we don't look at foster care and say, that's a really hospitable system. Or that's a place where kids find belonging. It's like the opposite of that. And so there's so much work to do in the space. And I think, having this idea of the long haul and having people like you, pioneers who are coming alongside saying, hey, we can do this, but it's going to be a hard road and I'm here to help you get there, as kind of a guide. I'm really grateful that you're doing the work. I'm sure it's not easy. You're running your own business, so that by itself is hard. You're entering into a place that has, your own trauma is intertwined with it. And so I'm sure that is a struggle as well. And it's something that you have to continually work through. I'm sure it's a lot on your family. And so truly, I mean, I could talk with you all day about this. I'm looking at the time already and I'm like, gosh, so many things, other things to get to, but I just want to applaud you in that. Thank you for taking the time and using that experience and offering it to others. That's a really courageous thing to do. So I really am grateful for it. And I know it's going to have a really lasting impact, more than you will ever know. That is actually happening.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you.
I want to shift over, unfortunately, because I want to talk to you about so many other things. But for the sake of time and our listeners, we typically go into a kind of a last five, a couple of more rapid fire questions just to share a little bit more about who you are. What is the best piece of advice you've ever received? Is there any one specific thing that would be kind of a best piece of advice that you can remember getting?
Yeah, and so I'm gonna be totally transparent. I did get these last five ahead of time, but I didn't look at them. So this is literally get raw and uncut.
We do give a heads up just in case.
Yeah, I did not take it. So I'm just gonna say this quote, and I feel like it's applied to a lot of things in my life now. But someone told me when I was getting recruited for college football, they just said, "When you know, you know." And I just think that piece of advice is like applied to so many aspects of my life, of just like the knowing being the feeling, not the language or the reasoning, but just like trust your gut of like, when you know, you know. And I'm moved. I'm led by my gut often. And with my wife, like after our first date, I told one of my sisters, I was like, I'm gonna marry her. I actually started planning in a weird way, planning our proposal after our first date. So it looks less crazy now because we're actually married, but
Sure.
I didn't
It
tell a lot of
turned out
people
two
then.
different ways.
Yeah, yeah. So when you know, and that has been true about the work that I've gotten into. Like I had no plan. I just knew like this is what I want to step into. I that was it. I didn't know the path. I didn't know anything else. So the advice that came to mind was when you know, you know.
Okay. Is there a bucket list item that you are determined to check off? Anything out there that you're just like, I gotta do this?
Yeah, I write a book. That is something that is very front of mind for me. And I have a lot of ideas spinning all the time. So it's just not easy to sit down and get one thought and galvanize my energy around that. But that is a bucket list item that is something I'm absolutely determined to get done. So that is one.
Once you do it, send it my way.
Yeah, I will. I will. You'll get a nice handwritten note. Yeah.
Yeah, I would love it. What's the most unusual talent that you have? We know you can play football. What else you got?
I would say this is a new talent that my wife has like thrown on my head, which I'm trying to embrace it. But interior design. I will say I'm very particular about things, and I'm kind of obsessive about something new. And so we just bought and moved into our home a month ago, and so we're just trying to make our like house a home. And I've just kind of dove into this world of interior design, and my wife is like, she's like shift early in our marriage. She'd be like, I don't hate it. Like this is fine. To where like she's like very on board with a lot of the design decisions that I'm like, just like, hey, we're going to do it. Trust like you may not see the vision yet, but just stick with me. I would say that's an unusual talent because I don't think like people come over to our house or see something like, oh, Michaela, when did you do that? And she's like, nope, that was Gaelin. And they're always shocked by that. Yeah.
That's good. That's good. If you could give a word of encouragement to a former foster youth or someone, a youth that's currently in the system, what would it be? I'm sure you get that question a lot.
Yeah. I mean, just a immediate off the bat encouragement is the decisions that you've made that have gotten you up until this point are, one, not your fault. Like, you don't have to carry around the shame and guilt that comes with making the decisions that you've been forced to make. But two, categorizing them in the right way as they were helpful. Like as like complicated and complex as they might have been, the fact that you are still here, that you're still standing, that you're still moving forward, that those decisions were in fact helpful. And that is something that I just like long after the relational effects of foster care wear off, there's just this ringing guilt and shame and second guessing. And man, if I could have gotten out of my own way, like it would have been different. And like, no, like it's not your fault, but also what you did was what your body needed for you to be at this point now. And so then release the tight grip we're holding on to the past and now be open-handed with the future, right? Like if you feel that about your past, there's nothing we can do to change it. You don't need to feel guilt or shame about it, but how can we make better and different decisions moving forward? I phrased it, I was just speaking in Missouri to teenagers in the system and just talked about them like, in what other context will we find it acceptable to look out of our rear view window to drive forward? Like what other context are we accepting that as a logical, life-giving way to move about, like getting from one point to another? And I just was like challenged them, like have that same perspective about the future. Like, yeah, if you the past is the past. It holds weight. It has value. It has impacted you, but don't use that as your guiding like principles for the future. And that's something that I think has been very helpful and impactful for me, is like the future does not have to be determined by what has happened in the past.
Yeah, that's really good. Kind of answers the question of a favorite quote or phrase too. So I'm gonna add that one in to number 2, because that phrase is really, really helpful. That analogy that you give. Sometimes you have to look in the rearview mirror to understand where you are, and sometimes you got to back up to go forward. But most of the time, if you're only looking in the rearview mirror, you're going to crash real fast. So using that as a tool, using the rearview mirror as a tool and not a guide, super helpful. That's better
than what I said. So to do the quote thing, I would just say Jelly Roll, when I think he won a Grammy, said it in his Grammy speech. He was like, there's a reason that the rear view mirror is smaller than the windshield. And so just to stick with that, there's a reason that your windshield is a lot bigger than the rear view window or mirror. So
helpful. If anyone in our audience wants to connect with you or your work outside of this podcast, how can they do that?
Yeah. So most active social media platform I'm on is Instagram. So if you type in my first and last name, you can find me. But my handle is giv.elmore. It's my initial. So, you can find me there. Or if you want to, in a formal way, reach out, go to my website, GaelinSpeaks.com. You can find my contact info there and reach out as well. But if you want to genuinely interact, Instagram's the best spot.
Okay. Sounds great. Truly, thank you. I hope that this is not the last conversation we have. I would love to bring you into Houston and do many more things together. So I'm already looking forward to that. Again, thank you for the work that you're doing. Thank you for sharing your story and having the courage to do that. It's very brave. And thank you for all the work that you're doing. We're really, really grateful. Thanks for spending your day with us. To those listening, we hope these conversations have inspired you to find your place along the river. And we welcome you to join us in bringing hope and renewal to the city of Houston. If you'd like more information on how to get involved, please visit riversideproject.org and submit a contact form. We'll see you next time.